all men democratically an equal opportunity for such training, and to restrict office aristocratically to those who proved themselves best, was the solution that China proposed for the ancient and insoluble problem of government. Therefore, it periodically arranged, in each district, a public examination to which all males of any age were eligible. It tested the applicant in his memory and understanding of the writings of Confucius, in his knowledge of Chinese poetry and history, and in his capacity to write intelligently on the issues of moral and political life. Those who failed might study more and try again. Those who succeeded received the degree of Xiu Cai, entitling them to membership in the literary class and to possible appointment to minor local offices. But more important than this, they became eligible, either at once or after further preparation, for the triennial provincial examinations, which offered similar but harder tests. Those who failed here might try again, and many did, so that some men passed these tests after 80 years of living and studying, and not a few died in the midst of the examinations. Those who succeeded were eligible for appointment to minor positions in the national service, and at the same time they were admitted to a final and especially severe examination at Peking. There in the examination hall were 10,000 cells, in which the contestants, cribbed and confined, lived with their own food and bedding for 3 separate days, while they wrote essays or theses on subjects announced to them after their imprisonment. The cells were unheated, uncomfortable, ill-lighted, and unsanitary. Only the spirit mattered. Typical tests were the composition of a poem on the theme, "The sound of the oars and the green of the hills and water," and the writing of an essay on this passage from the Confucian classics. Zhang Tse said, "To possess ability and yet ask of those who do not, to know much and yet inquire of those who know little, to possess and yet appear not to possess, to be full and yet appear empty." There was not a word in any of the tests about science, business, or industry. The object was to reveal not knowledge, but judgment and character. Those who survived the tests were at last eligible for the higher offices in the state. The defects of the plan grew in the course of time. Though dishonesty in taking or judging the tests was sometimes punished with death, dishonesty found a way. The purchase of appointments became frequent and flagrant in the 19th century. An inferior officer, for example, sold 20,000 forged diplomas before he was exposed. The form of the trial essay came to be a matter of custom, and students prepared themselves for it mechanically. The curriculum of studies tended to formalize culture and impede the progress of thought, for the ideas that circulated in it had been standardized for hundreds of years. The graduates became an official and intellectual bureaucracy, naturally arrogant and humanly selfish, occasionally despotic and often corrupt, and yet immune to public recall or control except through the desperate resort of the boycott or the strike. In short, the system had the faults that might be expected of any governmental structure conceived and operated by men. The faults of the system belonged to the men, not to the system, and no other had less. Seldom, says Dr. Latourette, has any large group of mankind been so prosperous and so nearly contented as were the Chinese under this governmental machinery when it was dominated by the ablest of the monarchs. This was likewise the opinion of the learned Captain Brinkley. The merits of the system were abundant. Here were no manipulated nominations, no vulgar campaigns of misrepresentation and hypocrisy, no sham battles of twin parties, no noisy or corrupt elections, no ascent to office through a meretricious popularity. It was a democracy in the best sense of the term, as equality of opportunity for all in the competition for leadership and place, and it was an aristocracy in its finest form, as a government by the ablest men, democratically selected from every rank in every generation. By this system the national mind and ambition were turned in the direction of study, and the national heroes and models were men of culture rather than masters of wealth. The Chinese, said Sir Robert Hart, worship talent. They delight in literature, and everywhere they have their little clubs for learning and for discussing each other's essays and verses. It was admirable that a society should make the experiment of being ruled, socially and politically, by men trained in philosophy and the humanities. It was an act of high tragedy when that system, and the entire civilization of which it formed the guiding part, were struck down and destroyed by the inexorable forces of evolution and history. Chapter 27. Revolution and Renewal. 1. The White Peril. The conflict of Asia and Europe, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the English, the opium trade, The Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, the war with Japan, the attempt to dismember China, the Open Door, the Empress Dowager, the reforms of Kwangshu, his removal from power, the Boxers, the Indemnity. Those forces took the form of the Industrial Revolution, a Europe vitalized and rejuvenated by the discovery of mechanical power and its application to ever-multiplying machinery, found itself capable of producing goods more cheaply than any nation or continent that still relied on handicrafts. It was unable to dispose of all these machine products to its own population because it paid its workers somewhat less than the full value of their labor. It was forced to seek foreign markets for the surplus and was driven by imperialist necessity to conquer the world. Under the compulsions of invention and circumstance, the 19th century became a worldwide drama of conflict between the old, mature, and fatigued civilizations of handicraft Asia and the young, jejune, and invigorated civilizations of industrial Europe. The commercial revolution of Columbus's time cleared the routes and prepared the way for the Industrial Revolution. Discoverers refound old lands, opened up new ports, and brought to the ancient cultures the novel products and ideas of the West. Early in the 16th century, the adventurous Portuguese, having established themselves in India, captured Malacca, sailed around the Malay Peninsula, and arrived with their picturesque ships and terrible guns at Canton in 1517. Truculent and lawless, regarding all Eastern peoples as legitimate prey, they were little if any better than pirates, and the natives treated them as such. Their representatives were imprisoned, their demands for free trade were refused, and their settlements were periodically cleansed with massacres by the frightened and infuriated Chinese. But in return for their aid against other pirates, the Portuguese were rewarded in 1557 by receiving from Peking full liberty to settle in Macau and to govern it as their own. There they built great opium factories, employing men, women, and children. One factory alone paid to the Portuguese provincial government a revenue of $1,560,000 per year. Then came the Spanish, conquering the Philippines in 1571 and setting themselves up in the Chinese island of Formosa. Then the Dutch. Then in 1637 5 English vessels sailed up the river to Canton, silenced with superior guns the batteries that opposed them, and disposed of their cargo. The Portuguese taught the Chinese to smoke and buy tobacco, and early in the 18th century began the importation of opium from India into China. The Chinese government forbade its use by the people, but the habit became so widespread that the annual consumption of the drug in China had raised its import to 4,000 chests by the year 1795. The government prohibited its importation in that year and reiterated the prohibition in 1800, appealing to importers and population alike against the weakening of national vitality by this powerful opiate. The trade proceeded briskly despite these discouragements. The Chinese were as anxious to buy as the Europeans were eager to sell, and the local officials gratefully pocketed the bribes connected with the trade. In 1838, the Peking government ordered the strict enforcement of the edict against the importation of opium, and a vigorous official, Lin Se-shu, commanded the foreign importers at Canton to surrender such quantities as they held in their stores. When they refused, he surrounded the foreign quarters, forced them to turn over to him 20,000 chests of the drug, and in a kind of Canton opium party, destroyed the contents completely. The British withdrew to Hong Kong and began the First Opium War. They protested that it was not an opium war, that their anger was rather at the insolent pride with which the Chinese government had received, or refused to receive, their representatives, and at the impediments in the form of severe taxation and corrupt courts which Chinese law and custom had raised against an orderly import trade. They bombarded those cities of China which they could reach from the coast, and compelled peace by capturing control at Chinkiang of the Grand Canal. The Treaty of Nanking avoided all mention of opium, ceded the island of Hong Kong to the British, forced Chinese tariffs down to 5%, opened 5 treaty ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningpo, and Shanghai, to foreign trade, levied upon China an indemnity to cover the cost of the war and the destroyed opium, and stipulated that British citizens in China, when accused of violating laws, should be tried and judged only by British courts. Other countries, including the United States and France, asked and obtained the application of these extraterritorial rights to their traders and nationals in China. This war was the beginning of the disintegration of the ancient regime. The government had lost face in its dealings with Europeans. It had first scorned, then defied, then yielded, and no courtly phrases could conceal the facts from educated natives or gloating foreigners. At once the authority of the government was weakened wherever the news of its defeat penetrated, and forces that might have held their peace broke out now in open rebellion against Peking. In 1843, an enthusiast named Hung Xiu-chuan, after a brief acquaintance with Protestantism and some visions, came to the conclusion that he had been chosen by God to rid China of idolatry and convert it to Christianity. Beginning with this modest purpose, Hung finally led a movement to overthrow the Manchus and establish a new dynasty, the Taiping, or Great Peace. His followers, actuated partly by religious fanaticism, partly by desire to reform China on Western lines, fought valiantly, smashed idols, slaughtered Chinese, destroyed many old libraries and academies and the porcelain works at Qingtaichen, captured Nanking, held it for 12 years, 1853 to 1865, marched on Peking while their leader wallowed in luxury and safety behind them, broke into disorder because of incompetent generalship, were defeated and fell back into the indiscriminate ocean of Chinese humanity. In the midst of this dangerous Taiping rebellion, the government was called upon to defend itself against Europe in the Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860. Great Britain, supported in varying degrees by France and the United States, demanded the legalization of the opium traffic, which had continued despite prohibitions between the wars, access to more cities, and the honorable admission of Western envoys to the court at Peking. When the Chinese refused, the French and English captured Canton, sent its viceroy in chains to India, took the forts at Yat-sen, advanced upon the capital, and destroyed the Summer Palace in revenge for the torture and execution of Allied emissaries in Peking. The victors forced upon the defeated a treaty that opened 10 new ports and the Yangtze River to foreign trade, arranged for the reception of European and American ministers and ambassadors on terms of equality with China, guaranteed toleration of missionaries and traders in every part of the country, removed missionaries from the jurisdiction of Chinese officials, further freed Western nationals from the operation of Chinese laws, ceded to Great Britain a strip of the mainland opposite Hong Kong, legalized the importation of opium, and charged China with an indemnity to pay for the cost of her tuition in Occidental ways. Encouraged by their easy victories, the European nations proceeded to help themselves to one piece of China after another. Russia took the territory north of the Amur and east of the Ussuri River in 1860. The French revenged the death of a missionary by appropriating Indochina in 1885. Japan pounced upon her neighbor and civilizer in a sudden war in 1894, defeated her in a year, took Formosa, liberated Korea from China for later, in 1910, absorption by Japan, and charged China with an indemnity of $170 million for causing so much trouble. On condition that China pay an additional indemnity to Japan, Russia prevented Japan from also taking the Liaotong Peninsula, which 3 years later Russia took over and fortified as her own. The murder of 2 missionaries by Chinese enabled Germany to seize the peninsula of Shantung in 1898. The realm of the once powerful government was divided into spheres of influence, in which one or another European power secured special privileges for mining and trade. Alarmed by the prospects of an actual partition, Japan, foreseeing her own later need of China, joined with America in a demand for an open door, that is, that while certain spheres of interest might be recognized, all nations should be allowed to trade in China on equal terms, tariffs and transport charges to be the same for all. To put herself in a proper position for bargaining in these matters, the United States took over the Philippines in 1898 and declared by this act her intention to share in the struggle for Chinese trade. Meanwhile, another and simultaneous act of the drama was being played behind palace walls in Peking. When the Allies entered the capital in triumph at the close of the Second Opium War in 1860, the young emperor, Xian Feng, fled to Johor. There, a year later, he died, leaving the throne to his 5-year-old son. The secondary wife, who had been the mother of this boy, took the reins of empire in her own hands, and as Zhu Xi, known to the world as the Dowager Empress, governed China ruthlessly, cynically, and well for a generation. In her youth she had ruled by beauty. Now she ruled by her wits and her will. When the son conveniently died on approaching his majority in 1875, the Empress, careless of precedent and objection, placed another minor, Guang Shu, on the throne and continued to rule. For a generation, with the help of clever statesmen like Li Hongchang, the doughty Empress kept China at peace and won for it a certain respect from the predatory powers. But the sudden invasion of China by Japan, and the rapid series of renewed spoliations by Europe after the triumph of the Japanese, caused a strong movement to rise in the capital in favor of imitating Japan's imitation of the West. That is, for organizing a large army, building railroads and factories, and striving to acquire the industrial wealth with which Japan and Europe had financed their victories. The Empress and her advisers opposed this tendency with all their influence, but it secretly won the adherence of Kwang Shu, who had now been permitted to ascend the throne as emperor in his own right. Suddenly, Kwang, without consulting old Buddha, as her court called the Empress, issued to the Chinese people in 1898 a series of astonishing decrees which, if they could have been accepted and enforced, would have advanced China vigorously and yet peaceably on the road to westernization, and might have averted the fall of the dynasty and the collapse of the nation into chaos and misery. The young emperor ordered the establishment of a new system of schools to teach not only the old Confucian classics, but the scientific culture of the West. The translation into Chinese of all the important works of Occidental science, literature, and technology, the encouragement of railroad building, and the reform of the army and the navy with a definite view to meeting the crisis, as he put it, where we are beset on all sides by powerful neighbors who craftily seek advantage from us, and who are trying to combine together in overpowering us. The Dowager Empress, shocked by what seemed to her the precipitate radicalism of these edicts, imprisoned Kwang Shu in one of the imperial palaces, annulled his decrees, and made herself again the government of China. A reaction now set in against all Western ideas, and the subtle dowager diverted it amiably to her purposes. An organization known as the Yi Ho Chuan, literally Righteous Harmony Fists, historically the Boxers, had been formed by some rebels who wished to overthrow the Empress and her dynasty. She persuaded its leaders to turn the fury of their movements against invading foreigners rather than against herself. The Boxers accepted the mission, called for the expulsion of all aliens from China, and in a frenzy of patriotic virtue began to kill Christians indiscriminately in many sections of the country in 1900. Allied soldiers again marched on Peking, this time to protect their nationals hiding in terror in the narrow quarters of the foreign legations. The Empress and her court fled to Xianfu, and the troops of England, France, Russia, Germany, Japan, and the United States sacked the city, killed many Chinese in revenge, and looted or ruined valuable property. Captain Brinkley writes, "It sends a thrill of horror through every white man's bosom to learn that 40 missionary women and 25 little children were butchered by the Boxers. But in Tungchao alone, a city where the Chinese made no resistance, and where there was no fighting, 573 Chinese women of the upper classes committed suicide, rather than survive the indignities they had suffered." The Allies imposed upon the broken Leviathan an indemnity of $330 million to be collected by European control of Chinese import customs and the salt monopoly. Considerable portions of this indemnity were later remitted to China by the United States, Great Britain, Russia, and Japan, usually with the stipulation that the remitted sums be spent in educating students from China in the universities of the remitting nation. It was a gesture of generosity which proved more effective in the undoing of old China than almost any other single factor in this historic and tragic conflict of East and West. 2. The death of a civilization. The indemnity students, their westernization, their disintegrative effect in China, the role of the missionary, Sun Yat-sen, the Christian, his youthful adventures, his meeting with Li Hongchang, his plans for a revolution, their success, Yuan Shikai, the death of Sun Yat-sen, chaos and pillage, communism, the North pacified, Chiang Kai-shek, Japan and Manchuria, at Shanghai. These indemnity students and thousands of others now left China to explore the civilization of its conquerors. Many went to England, more to Germany, more to America, more to Japan. Every year hundreds of them were graduated from the universities of America alone. They came at an early and impressionable age before they had matured to the point of understanding the depth and values of their own national culture. They drank in with gratitude and admiration the novel education given in the science, methods, history, and ideas of the West. They were amazed at the comforts and vigorous life they saw about them, the freedom of the Western individual, and the enfranchisement of the people. They studied Western philosophy, lost faith in the religion of their fathers, and enjoyed the position of respectable radicals encouraged by their educators and their new environment in their rebellion against all the elements in the civilization of their native land. Year by year, thousands of such deracinated youths returned to China, fretted against the slow tempo and material backwardness of their country, and sowed in every city the seeds of inquiry and revolt. An endless chain of circumstances helped them. For 2 generations, the merchants and missionaries who had conquered China from the west had acted, willingly or not, as centers of foreign infection. They had lived in a style and with such comforts and conveniences as made the young Chinese about them anxious to adopt so promising a civilization. They had undermined, in an active minority, the religious faith that had supported the old moral code. They had set one generation against another by advocating the abandonment of ancestor worship, and though they preached a gentle Jesus, meek and mild, they were protected in emergencies by guns, whose size and efficacy offered the dominating lesson of Europe to the Orient. Christianity, which had been in its origin an uprising of the oppressed, became once more, in these Chinese converts, a ferment of revolution. Among the converts was the leader of the revolution. In 1866, a tenant farmer near Canton fathered a troublesome boy whom the world, with no conscious sarcasm, was to christen Sun Yat-sen, that is, Sun, the Fairy of Tranquility. Sun became so Christian that he defaced the images of the gods in the temple of his native village. An older brother, who had migrated to Hawaii, brought the boy to Honolulu and placed him in a school conducted by an Anglican bishop and offering a thoroughly Occidental education. Returning to China, Sun entered the British Medical College and became its first Chinese graduate. Largely as a result of these studies, he lost all religious faith, and at the same time, the indignities to which he found himself and his fellow Chinese subjected at the foreign-controlled customs offices and in the foreign quarters of the treaty ports turned his thoughts to revolution. The inability of a corrupt and reactionary government to prevent the defeat of Great China by Little Japan, or the commercial partition of the country by European powers, filled him with humiliation and resentment, and made him feel that the first step in the liberation of China must be the overthrow of the Manchu dynasty. His first move was characteristic of his self-confidence, his idealism, and his simplicity. He boarded a steamer and traveled 1,600 miles north at his own expense to lay before Li Hongchang, vice-regent of the Empress Dowager, his plans for reforming the country and restoring its prestige. Refused a hearing, Sun began a lifetime of adventure and wandering in the quest of funds for a Chinese revolution. He won the support of many mercantile guilds and powerful secret societies, whose leaders were envious of the imperial aristocracy and longed for a government in which the new manufacturing and trading classes would play a role commensurate with their rising wealth. Then he traveled overseas to America and Europe, gathering modest sums from 1 million laundrymen and 1,000 Chinese merchants. In London, the Chinese legation illegally arrested him and was about to send him secretly to China in chains as a traitor to his government, when a missionary who had taught him in his youth aroused the British government to rescue him. For 15 years more he passed from city to city over the world, collecting all in all $2.5 million for the revolution. And apparently he spent almost none of this money on himself. Suddenly, in the midst of his travels, a message informed him that the revolutionary forces had won the South, were winning the North, and had chosen him as provisional president of the Chinese Republic. A few weeks later he landed in triumph at Hong Kong, where 20 years back he had been humiliated by the British officials of the port. The Empress Dowager had died in 1908, having arranged the death of the imprisoned Emperor Guangxu the day before. She was succeeded by Guang's nephew, Pu Yi, now Emperor of Manchukuo. In the last years of the Great Dowager and the first of her infant heir, many reforms in the direction of modernizing China were effected by the government. Railways were built, chiefly with foreign capital and under foreign management. Examinations for public office were abandoned. A new system of schools was established. A National Assembly was called for 1910, and a 9-year program was laid down for the gradual establishment of a constitutional monarchy, culminating in universal suffrage, growing step by step with universal education. The decree announcing this program added, "Any impetuosity shown in introducing these reforms will, in the end, be so much labor lost." But the revolution could not be halted by this deathbed repentance of an ailing dynasty. On February 12, 1912, the young emperor, faced by revolt on every side and finding no army willing to defend him, abdicated, and the regent, Prince Chun, issued one of the most characteristic edicts in Chinese history. Today the people of the whole empire have their minds bent upon a republic. The will of Providence is clear, and the people's wishes are plain. How could I, for the sake of the glory and the honor of one family, thwart the desire of teeming millions? Wherefore I, with the Emperor, decide that the form of government in China shall be a constitutional republic, to comfort the longing of all within the empire, and to act in harmony with the ancient sages who regarded the throne as a public heritage. The revolutionists behaved magnanimously to Pu Yi. They gave him his life, a comfortable palace, an ample annuity, and a concubine. The Manchus had come in like lions, and had gone out like lambs. The new republic paid for its peaceful birth with a stormy life. Yuan Shikai, a diplomat of the old school, possessed an army that might have impeded the revolution. He demanded the presidency as the price of his support, and Sun Yat-sen, only beginning to enjoy his office, yielded and retired magnificently to private life. Yuan, encouraged by strong financial groups, native and foreign, plotted to make himself emperor and to found a new dynasty, on the ground that only in this way could the incipient breakup of China be stayed. Sun Yat-sen branded him as a traitor and called upon his followers to renew the revolution, but before the issue could come to battle, Yuan took sick and died. China has not known order or unity since. Sun Yat-sen proved too idealistic, too good an orator and too poor a statesman to take the reins and guide his nation to peace. He passed from one plan and theory to another, offended his middle-class supporters by his apparent acceptance of communism, and retired to Canton to teach and inspire its youth and occasionally to rule its people. He died at Peking in 1925, at the most opportune moment for his conservative enemies. China, left without a government that all sections would recognize, deprived of the unifying symbol of the monarchy, broken of its habit of obedience to custom and law, and weak in the patriotism that attaches the soul not to a district but to the country as a whole, fell into an intermittent war of North against South, of section against section, of property against hunger, of old against young. Adventurers organized armies, ruled as tuchuns over isolated provinces, levied their own taxes, raised their own opium, and sallied forth occasionally to annex new victims to their subject population. Industry and trade, taxed by one victorious general after another, fell into disorder and despair. Bandits exacted tribute, stole and killed, and no organized force could control them. Men became soldiers or thieves lest they should starve, and ravaged the fields of men who, so despoiled, became soldiers or thieves lest they should starve. The savings of a lifetime or the modest stores of a thrifty family were, as often as not, appropriated by a general or looted by a robber band. In the province of Honan alone, in 1931, there were 400,000 bandits. In the midst of this chaos, 1922, Russia sent two of its ablest diplomats, Karakan and Yofei, with orders to bring China into the circle of the Communist Revolution. Karakan prepared the way by surrendering Russia's claims to extraterritoriality, and by signing a treaty that recognized the full authority and international status of the revolutionary government. The subtle Yofei found little difficulty in converting Sun Yat-sen to sympathy with communism, for Sun had been rebuffed by every other power. In an incredibly short time, with the help of 70 Soviet officers, a new nationalist army was formed and trained. Under command of Sun's former secretary, Chiang Kai-shek, but guided largely by a Russian advisor, Michael Borodin, this army marched northward from Canton, conquered one city after another, and finally established its power in Peking. In the moment of victory, the victors divided. Chiang Kai-shek attacked the communist movement in Oriental style and established a military dictatorship realistically responsive to the will of business and finance. It is as difficult for a nation as for an individual to take no comfort from a neighbor's misfortune. Japan, which in the plans of Sun Yat-sen was to be the friend and ally of China against the West, and which had stimulated the Chinese revolt by her swift and successful imitation of Europe in industry, diplomacy, and war, saw in the disorder and weakness of her ancient teacher an opportunity for solving the problems that had arisen out of her very success. For Japan could not discourage the growth of her population without endangering her capacity for self-defense against obviously possible aggression. She could not support an increasing population unless she developed industry and trade. She could not develop industry without importing iron, coal, and other resources in which her own soil was deficient, nor could she develop trade profitably unless she had a large share in the only great market left free by the European colonization of the globe. But China was supposedly rich in iron and coal, and offered at Japan's door potentially the greatest market in the world. What nation, faced with the apparent choice between returning to agriculture and subjection, or advancing to industrial imperialism and conquest, could have resisted the temptation to snatch the prizes of prostrate China, while the other imperial vultures were tearing one another's throats on the fields of France? So Japan, soon after the outbreak of the Great War, declared herself at war with Germany, and pounced upon the Kiao territory which Germany had leased from China 16 years before. Then she presented to the government of Yuan Shikai 21 demands, which would have made China a political and economic colony of Japan, and only the protest of the United States and the boycott of Japanese goods in China under the leadership of its enraged students prevented these commands from being enforced. Students wept in the streets or killed themselves in shame at the humiliation of their country. The Japanese listened with cynical humor to the moral indignation of a Europe that had been gnawing at China for half a century, and waited patiently for another opportunity. It came when Europe and America were engulfed in the debacle of an imperialist industry that had depended upon foreign markets for the absorption of surplus products unpurchasable by their producers at home. Japan marched into Manchuria, set up the former emperor of China, Pu Yi, first as president, then as emperor of the new state of Manchukuo, and by political alliance, economic penetration, and military control, placed herself in a favored position for the exploitation of Manchuria's natural resources, employable population, and commercial possibilities. The European world, which had proposed a moratorium on robbery after it had gathered in all available spoils, joined America feebly in protests against this candid plunder, but prepared as always to accept victory as justification in the end. The final humiliation came at Shanghai. Angered by the successful boycott of her goods, Japan landed her undefeated troops at the richest port in China, occupied and destroyed the district of Chapei, and demanded the restraint of the boycott associations by the Chinese government. The Chinese defended themselves with a new heroism, and the 19th Route Army from Canton, almost unaided, held the well-equipped forces of Japan at bay for 2 months. The Nanking government offered a compromise. Japan withdrew from Shanghai, and China, nursing its wounds, resolved to build from the bottom a new and more vigorous civilization, capable of preserving and defending itself against a rapacious world. 3. The beginnings of a new order. Change in the village, in the town, the factories, commerce, labor unions, wages, the new government, nationalism versus westernization, the dethronement of Confucius, the reaction against religion, the new morality, marriage in transition, birth control, coeducation, the new tide in literature and philosophy, the new language of literature, Hushi, elements of destruction, elements of renewal. Once, everything changed except the East. Now there is nothing in the East that does not change. The most conservative nation in history has suddenly become, after Russia, the most radical, and is destroying with a will customs and institutions once held inviolate. It is not merely the end of a dynasty, as in 1644, it is the molting of a civilization. Change comes last and least to the village, for the slow sobriety of the soil does not encourage innovation. Even the new generation must plant in order to reap. But now 7,000 miles of railroad traverse the countryside, and though a decade of chaos and native management has left them in bad repair, and war has conscripted them too often for its purposes, yet they bind the eastern villages with the cities of the coast, and daily bear their trickle of western novelties into 1 million peasant homes. Here one may find such foreign devilish importations as kerosene, kerosene lamps, matches, cigarettes, even American wheat. For sometimes, so poor is transport, it costs more to carry goods from the Chinese interior to the marine provinces than it does to bring them to these from Australia or the United States. It becomes clear that the economic growth of a civilization depends upon transportation. 20,000 miles of dirt roads have been built, over which, with oriental irregularity, 6,000 buses travel, always full. When the gasoline engine has bound these innumerable villages together, it will have accomplished one of the greatest changes in Chinese history, the end of famine. In the towns, the triumph of the West goes on more rapidly. Handicrafts are dying under the competition of cheaply transported machine-made goods from abroad. Millions of artisans flounder about in unemployment, and are drawn into the jaws of the factories that foreign and domestic capital is building along the coast. The hand loom, still spinning in the village, is silent in the city. Imported cotton and cotton cloths flood the country, and textile factories rise to induct impoverished Chinese into the novel serfdom of the mill. Great blast furnaces burn at Hankow, as weird and horrible as any in the West. Canneries, bakeries, cement works, chemical works, breweries, distilleries, power works, glass works, shoe factories, paper mills, soap and candle factories, sugar refineries, all of them have now been planted on Chinese soil, and slowly transform the domestic artisan into a factory hand. The development of the new industries is retarded because investment hesitates in a world disordered by permanent revolution. It is obstructed further by the difficulty and costliness of transport, by the inadequacy of local raw materials, and by that amiable Chinese habit which places the family above every other loyalty, and turns every native office and factory into a nest of genial nepotism and incompetence. Commerce, too, is impeded by inland tariffs and coastal customs, and the universal demand for bribes or squeeze. But it is growing more rapidly than industry, and plays the central role in the economic transformation of China. The new industries have destroyed the guilds and have thrown into chaos the relations of employer and employee. The guilds had lived by regulating wages and prices through agreements between owners and workers whose products had no rivals in local trade. But as transport and commerce increased and brought distant goods to compete in every town with the handiwork of the guilds, it was found impossible to control prices or to regulate wages, without surrendering to the dictates of foreign competitors and capital. The guilds have therefore disintegrated and divided into chambers of commerce on the one side and labor unions on the other. The chambers discuss order, loyalty, and economic liberty, and the workers discuss starvation. Strikes and boycotts are frequent, but they have been more successful in compelling foreign concessions to the Chinese government than in raising the remuneration of labor. In 1928, the Department of Social Affairs of the Chinese municipality of Shanghai computed the average weekly wage of the textile mill workers as varying from $1.73 to $2.76 for men, and from $1.10 to $1.78 for women. In flour mills, the male weekly average pay was $1.96, in cement mills $1.72, in glass works $1.84, in match factories $2.11, among the skilled workers of the electric power plants $3.10, in the machine shops $3.24, among the printers $4.55. The wealth enjoyed by the printers was doubtless due to their better organization and the cost of suddenly replacing them. The first unions were formed in 1919. They grew in number and power until, in the days of Borodin, they proposed to take over the management of China. They were repressed ruthlessly after Chiang Kai-shek's break with Russia. Today the laws against them are severe, but they multiply nevertheless as the sole refuge of the workers against an industrial system that has only begun to pass labor legislation and has not yet begun to enforce it. The bitter destitution of the city proletaires, working 12 hours a day, hovering on the margin of subsistence, and facing starvation if employment should fail, is worse than the ancient poverty of the village, where the poor could not see the rich, and accepted their lot as the natural and immemorial fate of mankind. Perhaps some of these evils might have been avoided if the political transformation of eastern China had not been so rapid and complete. The Mandarin aristocracy, though it had lost vitality and was dishonored with corruption, might have held the new industrial forces in check until China could accept them without chaos or slavery. And then the growth of industry would have generated year by year a new class that might have stepped peaceably into political power, as the manufacturers had displaced the landed aristocracy of England. But the new government found itself without an army, without experienced leaders, and without funds. The Kuomintang, or People's Party, established to liberate a nation, found that it must stand by while foreign and domestic capital subjugated it. Conceived in democracy and baptized with the blood of communism, it became dependent upon Shanghai bankers, abandoned democracy for dictatorship, and tried to destroy the unions. For the party depends upon the army, and the army upon money, and money upon loans. Until the army is strong enough to conquer China, the government cannot tax China. And until it can tax China, the government must take advice where it takes its funds. Even so, it has accomplished much. It has brought back to China full control over her tariffs, and, within the internationalism of finance, over her industries. It has organized, trained, and equipped an army which may someday be used against others than Chinese. It has enlarged the area that acknowledges its authority, and has reduced in that area the banditry that was stifling the nation's economic life. It takes a day to make a revolution, and a generation to make a government. The disunity of China reflects and follows from the division that lies in the Chinese soul. The most powerful feeling in China today is hatred of foreigners. The most powerful process in China today is imitation of foreigners. China knows that the West does not deserve this flattery, but China is forced by the very spirit and impetus of the times to give it, for the age offers to all nations the choice of industrialism or vassalage. So the Chinese of the eastern cities pass from fields to factories, from robes to trousers, from the simple melodies of the past to the saxophone symphonies of the West. They surrender their own fine taste in dress and furniture and art, adorn their walls with European paintings, and erect office buildings in the least attractive of American styles. Their women have ceased to compress their feet from north to south and begin, in the superior manner of the Occident, to compress them from east to west. Some Chinese women pad their shoes to conceal the fact that their feet were bound. Their philosophers abandon the unobtrusive and mannerly rationalism of Confucius and take up with Renaissance enthusiasm the pugnacious rationalism of Moscow, London, Berlin, Paris, and New York. The dethronement of Confucius has something of the character of both the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. It is at once the overthrow of the Chinese Aristotle and the rejection of the racial gods. For a time, the new state persecuted Buddhism and the monastic orders. Like the revolutionists of France, the Chinese rebels were freethinkers without concealment, openly hostile to religion, and worshipping only reason. Confucianism tolerated the popular faiths, on the assumption, presumably, that as long as there is poverty there will be gods. The revolution, fondly believing that poverty can be destroyed, had no need of gods. Confucianism took agriculture and the family for granted, and formulated an ethic designed to maintain order and content within the circle of the home and the field. The revolution is bound for industry, and needs a new morality to accord with urban and individual life. Confucianism endured because access to political office and scholarly occupations demanded a knowledge and acceptance of it. But the examinations are gone, and science takes the place of ethical and political philosophy in the schools. Man is now to be molded not to government, but to industry. Confucianism was conservative and checked the ideals of youth with the caution of old age. The revolution is made of youth, and will have none of these ancient restraints. It smiles at the old sage's warning that he who thinks the old embankments useless and destroys them is sure to suffer from the desolation caused by overflowing water.